Now I have the pleasure and honor to introduce the moderator for the session of today, who is Patrick Gattara, Senior Editor for Inclusive Storytelling at the New Humanitarian. Patrick leads effort to decolonize the coverage of humanitarian crisis and works to expand the New Humanitarians network of local contributors, and spearheads a new fellowship programs, as well as working across the newsroom and the organization to explore formats that challenge some of the Western-centric narrative habits of traditional journalism. Now, without further ado, over to you, Patrick.
Thanks a lot for that, Miriam. As Miriam said, my name is Patrick Gattara. I'm coming to you from Nairobi, Kenya. I've been with the New Humanitarian for about 5 months now. And it's been really an exciting journey in looking at how, at least on the media side, we can address some of the problematic narratives that Miriam has pointed out in her introduction. So today we are really looking at the development sector, and we're joined by a really sort of high-powered panel, people who have worked in storytelling, both from the sector itself within global agencies, and as well as in media and advertising. So I'll just introduce a panel, and then we'll jump into our discussions, which will hopefully focus on exactly how the role that civil society organizations can play, how they can foster ethical storytelling, and how we can change some of the practices that we have, some of the issues that people have had with them. So to introduce a panel, we're joined by Clare Spurrell, who is from Clare International. She's the Director of Strategy and Communications there. She has worked as a journalist in the UK for major news outlets, including The Independent and The Times, has launched award-winning digital platforms and an online mental health service. She worked for in digital teams for the BBC and NBC. At Care, she supports Care in all areas of communications, and believes in ethical, inclusive, and locally driven approaches to how we tell the story of the work that we do. We're also joined by Levis Nderitu, who is PATH's Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. He's also based in Nairobi, as I am. Levis is responsible for refining and implementing PATH's DEI strategy, and has had more than 10 years experience in international development and private sector, in the private sector. Also from PATH, we have David Verga, who leads all the writing, editing, and graphic design in support of PATH's brand, and directs the ongoing evolution of PATH's brand guidelines. We're also joined by Shalini Moodley, who's the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of the advertising and communication agency MetroGroup. She is based in Congo, and in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where she's been for, I think, about 16 years. She has also served as a chapter lead for putting out the ethical storytelling toolkit, and that was for the Hilton Foundation, which is run by MC Sachi and Sachi. So perhaps you'll also talk about the journey towards what that toolkit is, and how it can help the agencies and organizations tell better stories. Right, so maybe I'll start with you, Shalini. Obviously, in your work in ethical in advertising, you've dealt a lot with civil society organizations trying to tell better stories. What has been your experience there? And what have been some of the issues, the problems that you've noticed? And perhaps you could give us examples of what has actually been done well and what can be learned from, what people can learn, what other organizations can learn from in that regard. Shalini?
Hello, guys. Thank you so much, Patrick, for the introduction. And also, just to add to the introduction, I'm Indian, brown skin, wearing glasses, black hair. So I've been, as you mentioned, in the Congo for 16 years, and there's been quite a few challenges when it comes to ethical storytelling. Just to paint a little bit background about Congo, it's a very harsh climate. It's harsh politically and economically, and people don't like to tell their stories. They get harassed, arrested, and in some instances, sadly, have been killed for telling their stories. So they do not trust that their stories will have any positive impact on their lives. There's even a local saying that loosely translates to, "It is not you who will make the country better." So people that should be telling us their stories have lost trust in us, in the process, in their government, and in organizations that's meant to help them. And in my journey of the storytelling project, there are some of the things that have helped build trust in communities. And I'm hoping to share some of these points with you. And I'm going to get quickly to the point because I could talk for hours on this. Firstly, right at the beginning, the planning process. As a local agency, I get very excited when I can bag a deal or get the client, and living by the mantra, the client is always right. But it's been wrong because a lot of the times the client is already coming with a narrative, and we're supposed to create and produce a story that sticks within this narrative. And this is where the authenticity of the story gets jeopardized. So we need to start from the planning process. We need to draw proper guidelines. And in the brief, it is very important to get the operations team, the team on the ground involved in the briefing session. We need to know what's happening on the ground, what the environment like, and where are we with the project. The more information we have about the project and environment in advance, the better it is for our storytelling process. And it also helps eliminate some of the assumptions, because assumptions is also what jeopardizes the story. I want to also add, having roundtables and market surveys with key stakeholders will help better define the guidelines of the project. Scouting. Can't emphasize how important this is. Even before taking out the camera, research the place, the history, the political climate, the people. A country like Congo is over 100 million people. Each village has different sets of customs, different sets of nuances that you need to take into account. The political climate is different. So even before getting to the place, you need to establish contact. Having contact with a local translator or a facilitator that will help you understand the landscape is very important. When you go to a location, even before, as an agency, even before arriving to the location, you speak to the translator or facilitator, you explain to them when you're coming, why you're coming, what you should do in order to be prepared for this trip. It's even more important that the community know that you are coming, know the reason why you are there. It's a deep sign of respect. I mean, you wouldn't show up at someone's home uninvited and say, "Hi, I'm going to record you, so please tell me your story." So it's in the small things that make the biggest difference. Map out the cultural diversity of a place and understand the local customs. In our case, we had to meet with village leaders or community leaders and ask them for permission to start shooting the project or be in the community. Once the village leader approves or gives his approval, then the community opens up to us. It's a deep sign of respect and how we start to build trust. And the mapping is important because in some cases it could be religious leaders or influential people, but knowing where to start. Now, once the community opens up to you in that way that you've gotten the approval, this is where the building trust starts. What I found worked for me is that we embed ourselves in the community. Community is key. We try to become a part of the community. And in the last documentary that we did, we lived with one of the people that we were going to interview. We stayed in his house. We ate dinners with them. We even watched a football match that his son played at. But I know not every project has these kind of timelines, but we need to factor in time to talk to people, time to have authentic conversations before the camera gets out. Understand their limits, understand their fears, their concerns, and what they would like to get out of the project. Now, this is already building that sense of trust, and it's taking away that element of stranger. Because what I found before doing this is that when you come in and start shooting, then the immediate response is, okay, tell me what you want me to say, and I'll say, do you want me to smile? Do you want me to cry? Should I hold my baby while talking to you? Just pay me and I'll tell you what I want. We need to move away from that because that's what's been happening. And communities, people living in these communities are amongst the poorest of the poor. They just need to eat. So if you pay them, they will tell you what you want to hear. And they're used to that. So we need to shift that dynamics now to say, okay, but we want you to tell your story. Then moving from that, we need to go to consent. Now, consent has been a factor that's been abused in the past as well, because people don't know what they were signing, and people didn't know how their image was going to be used, how the interview was going to be edited and angled and directed, so they lost trust in the storytelling process. So what I do is I get a translator that goes through the consent in detail and in their language. Even if they say, okay, no, I understand English, but it's better to go through it in their language because it shows you respect them, you respect their story, and you want their feedback. So it's important to go through proper consent. I also use a lot of locals in the production process because using people from the community helps build the trust. So wherever I can, sometimes it's not possible, but wherever I can, from facilitators to translators, photographers, even guys helping with logistics. It shows that we are being part of the community. So I know I'm going quite fast because I don't have a lot of time, but one of the things I found through the projects is going back. Once we've worked on a project, it's so important to go back and showcase what we've done, because it's important for people to see that their voices are being heard. It's important for them to see that they are now contributing to the solution and not seen as the problem that needs to be fixed. So one thing I've started doing is going back, because I learned from one of the projects we were working on, and it still a bit haunts me today, was when a woman told us a story about how women give birth in these villages, and she took us to a field and said, this is the place where we come to die, because this is the place where we give birth and there's no hospitals around. She opened herself up to us. And we got her story, and when I told the client, or when we showcased it, we were told, no, it's too sad, and we don't want to get the government angry, so get somebody that's more enthusiastic about the project and the future. So we cut it. We never even went back to the place. We never showcased the documentary because the bigger scale, the project was stopped. The client pulled out and said, okay, we're not publishing. And that taught me that it's not just about building trust, but it's about maintaining trust. So to go back and showcase and to work within the community is also so important. And
okay. I'll have to interrupt you there because just because of time constraint. But it's amazing. I just wanted to have a quick question for you on that. I mean, obviously, you get clients, they come, they want to tell stories, and they have their own agendas. They're appealing, whether it's to donors or to their own publics and stuff. But you also speak about stories from the ground. So could you, in your view, who is the storyteller? Is it the person who's commissioning you for the story, or is it you as a person who goes and writes it up? Or is it the person in the community who's telling you the experiences?
The storytelling process has everyone involved in the storytelling. It's all players, and that is why it's so controversial and it's a balancing act. So everyone has a part in the story process, and that is why we need to respect everybody's part in the storytelling process. So
right, but do you all own the story collectively?
Sorry?
So it's not just a story of the people on the ground, it is our story, all of us.
It's our story because it's partly based on the project, it's partly funding, it's partly government, and then it's the people's story that are telling it that's pertaining to the project.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So you need to take it as a full ecosystem.
Okay, all right. Well, point made. We'll come back to that. Claire, if I may come to you, I don't know that you're able to switch on your. All right, excellent. If I may come to you, so could you give us an idea of Claire's journey in storytelling? What have you guys done? What problems have you encountered, and what are you actually doing to address them?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, and hi everyone. Nice to be here with you today. For the benefit of the blind and visually impaired, I am a white lady. I have blonde hair, black glasses, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. So Clare's journey actually started, and I'll try to keep this brief, but Clare's journey actually started consciously, I think, here at the ICSE. So it's quite interesting to be coming back some 4 or 5 years later, when a gentleman called Thomas Coombs, who used to work at Amnesty, started to launch a discussion around hope-based communications. I think it was around 2018. And like him at Clare, we were originally quite concerned about how some of our own images, for example, those that were showing flows of refugees, were unintentionally feeding into a sort of a weaponization and a fear-mongering that was really emerging from certain parts of the hard right, so particularly around issues of migration, refugees, and human rights. So we started that conversation there, and this really set a flame under our communications working group, which is at Clare consists of around 200 people working in communications globally at all different levels across Clare. And they were particularly asking the question, are we fulfilling our promise to do no harm in our communications as much as we do for our programming? So questions were raised around, certain images we were producing, whether they were enforcing negative stereotypes, whether through flying in the sort of the white male photographer from the global north, we were portraying white saviourism, white gaze was coming into our narrative. So over a process of about 18 months, which I'll come to, this led to the development of what we call our global comms commitments. I refer to them as our 6 seeds of change. And they cover various different areas around investing in local talent. So, commissioning local photographers, videographers, local spokespeople, applying justice-based narratives, co-creating with partners and communities, and addressing and challenging stereotypes within our storytelling. So as part of that latter commitment specifically, we committed to performing an audit of our image database every 2 years, and we're just about to launch into our 3rd audit this year. So my role very much was as an observer and facilitator of these conversations, and to ensure that the work was prioritised and seen across the wider organisation, and particularly at the top tables. So as part of that role, I kind of captured loads of learnings through that process, but I think I'll share 3 with you today. There is a 4th, but I don't know if we'll have time. The first one is, don't start the conversation in leadership spaces, including at my level. The global comms commitments were really developed through a really powerful bottom-up approach. They sort of organically developed through this very much bottom-up approach, which was driven by, I think it was around 18 communicators working across 7 different regions across Clare. They followed a series of global conversations which brought colleagues from all over the world to share different perspectives. We looked at harmful and positive imagery together. We worked in breakout groups to identify weaknesses. We've invited partners, participants into these spaces. And we've really asked quite difficult and challenging questions of each other. And it's been a really enlightening process. So the process in some ways has been the most powerful. The comms commitments, I think, because the process was so bottom up, really received very strong buy-in, because they were co-developed. So they kind of started as a set of promises that we made together as a diverse group towards our programme participants and the communities that we work. But then they've subsequently been mandated at board level. They've helped to inform the NGO discussions as part of the Pledge 2 in the Pledge for Change development, which I was a part of. And as we look at the results of the 2nd audit we've done last year, we're starting to see significant progress as well as being able to identify gaps and sort of find ways to continue the conversation. So, for example, we've seen a 3-fold increase in images taken by women, largely local to the communities they work, whereas in 2020, 61% of our images were being taken by men. Secondly, wherever and whoever you are, you will have a level of unconscious bias. So an interesting finding of our last audit was there was actually really wide variance regarding images that were analysed independently by 2 or more reviewers on more subjective areas. So questions around whether an image is reinforcing a stereotype, whether they are dignified, whether they are empowered. So our volunteer group was 30 reviewers from across 16 countries, 10 from the Global South. And while there was really strong agreement on those that sort of showed dignity or positive portrayals, where there was a struggle was really on the other side. What was seen as undignified, what is disempowered, what is reinforcing a stereotype. So this suggests that there's quite a wide variance in terms of subjective bias around some of these areas. And how they can't really be easily understood through, a list of defining characteristics or, a kind of, this is what this looks like and this is what that looks like. There's a real grey area. So, a good example would be in an emergency situation, someone may find themselves in a very undignified situation, such as a humanitarian emergency, but it doesn't mean to say they're not empowered. So how do you sort of capture that nuance, I think, is some of the questions that we are trying to kind of juggle with. And then finally, Shalini talked about informed consent, and I just want to add to that because I think she spoke so beautifully on that. So, we see, okay, from our last audit, 81% of the images that we analysed now had consent, which was, we still have a way to go on that, but that was a significant improvement from the year before, from 2020. But I think from the discussions, what we've also kind of learned is that informed consent is more than a box ticking exercise. And I think Shalini talks of this. So I would just really encourage, I do this when I travel with Clare, is to ask to watch the informed consent process happening, because it's often not being done by communicators. It may be done by programme teams or others. If it's taking 30 seconds, it's not informed. This is a conversation that should take 30 minutes or more. And just second to that, particularly in sort of fast evolving humanitarian contexts, you sometimes need to make different judgment calls around this, which is really through the lens of your own humanity. You know, the informed consent process can't undermine, for example, your commitments to do no harm. So, you know, an example would be during COVID, you know, we couldn't get people to sign forms because they'd be breaching social distancing. During an earthquake, you don't want to be asking search and rescue teams to, you know, sign an informed, you know, so there are certain situations where I think on, you know, legally you would talk about it through the lens of, you know, is there legitimate interest in this image? But I think you need to also balance certain questions around, you know, do the people who are, you know, suffering in a humanitarian emergency want their story to be told to the world, which is often very true. But against that, you know, if this was an image of your son, your brother, your mum, would you still share that with the world? So a lot of this is about, you know, really making some, particularly, as I said, in those humanitarian situations, making some judgment calls. And actually one thing we have, and again, going back to that bias point, this is often something you can't do alone. So at Clare, we actually have we have an ethics committee now that is very much focused on answering that specific question, which I think is really helpful. So I will leave it there.
Right, I was actually about to jump in.
Yes.
I just wanted to follow up just a bit on what you said at the very end, and this tension between wanting to tell the story, for example, in a humanitarian emergency situation, you know, obviously there is you're going into this with a purpose, you know, so perhaps you want to highlight what the problem is so that people can then donate and help and stuff. But also want to maintain the dignity of the people that you are photographing, you know, and as you pointed out, a lot of times these are people in undignified circumstances. So could you talk a bit about how Clare navigates that seeming conundrum?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where we're really reliant on our teams on the ground as well to, you know, to be able to kind of help us make some of those judgment calls, particularly around, you know, the sort of willingness and the desire of communities to have that story told and how they want it to be told. But I think, you know, for example, we, you know, for the Ukraine emergency, where you had all these, you know, the majority of the refugees that were coming out were women with children, and some people were saying, well, that's promoting a gender stereotype, but the reality is all the men were kept in because they were forced to fight. So sometimes, you know, you're kind of dealing with these difficult tensions that you have to sort of look at, and I think there is no one there is no cookie cutter approach to it. I think a lot of it is about having real judgment calls. I'm often being asked, you know, can we put this image up of these children, or, you know, various other things, and I have to say no, however beautiful the image may be, because I'm not sure that, you know, informed consent has been fully achieved. Or, you know, I think with children, for example, you have to be extremely difficult, you know, careful anyway. So I think it is, a lot of it is about just making sort of experienced judgment calls and making sure you have, you know, Clare is often in communities, we've been there 60 plus years, so we have really close connections with the communities that we're working in. So it's really about leaning into some of that as well.
Right. I think in the panel session, I'll also want to explore where culture comes into this, because as you mentioned, everybody comes at this at a bias, and do people have different ideas of what being undignified means, you know, and then how do you navigate that as well? But for now, David, let me come to you. Could you perhaps tell us what Path's experience has been, and you know, how its messaging has evolved to include this idea of inclusive storytelling? And perhaps we should even ask, what does inclusive storytelling mean to Path?
Thanks so much for that question, Patrick, and thank you for having me here today. For those just listening in, I'm a white man with dark brown hair, wearing a blue shirt and black glasses. Path's journey in this regard is still very much in progress. I mean, there's a larger transformation of the institution underway, and that's really experiencing at Path and across the sector. And I'll let Levi speak to that more. He's better positioned for it. But that obviously looks like changing the makeup of our leadership, of our staff, more equitably distributing resources and full-time positions and leadership authority to the places around the world where Path works. But with regards to our communication standards, where I work and focus my attention, I really think of our evolution as breaking down into two phases. And the first phase has been going on for the last several years, and it's really been focused on harm reduction. And so what that looks like for us at Path is developing and distributing clearer guidance for communicators to follow and making some obvious changes that probably everyone on this call is familiar with. Things like shifting narratives away from deficit framings or savior framings for the organization. For us at Path, it's also been about shifting the lens and what kind of story we're focusing on in the first place. For us as an organization, we primarily work at the level of the health system, and we're primarily partnering with ministries of health, with government agencies, and we don't really have a lot of direct contact with community members. That's not where our staff works. We're primarily supporting health workers, doctors, nurses, members of ministry. And so those are the stories that we've started focusing on telling instead. So rather than focusing on an individual community member who may have received a vaccine, for example, we're focused on the stories of our own staff and of the professional colleagues that they're working with who are members of the health system. We've also taken steps, really important sort of structural steps, like emptying out problematic images from our media bank, making our consent guidelines more stringent. Claire, I love what you said about transitioning from a kind of box ticking consent approach to something that's really more like informed consent that happens in a local language. And Shalini, to your point, that involves circling back and sharing the content with the people included to ensure that they're okay with it. It's even meant updating our risk guidelines so that when we review communications for risk, we're not only reviewing for institutional risk, but we're reviewing for potential risk to anyone included in the communication. Is this person's identity going to be released in a way they don't want to? You know, we talk a lot at Path because we do a lot of digital health work. We talk a lot about the privacy of patient information. That same level of stringency should apply to the photographs we take and the stories we tell. People's privacy needs to be protected. So the whole first phase has been focused on harm reduction. And of course, we still have work to do there, and that's still going to be going on in the background. But the second phase, which we're just now beginning, and that I'm so excited to partner with Levi's on and with our regional DEI advisory boards, is going to be focused more on developing regionally contextualized guidance for Path staff around story gathering, around compensation, and those kinds of details. Though we've been on this journey for several years, I think we're still living into the brand, and we're still experiencing the challenges of making some of these shifts. You know, you meet resistance within your own organization for communicators who just want to do things the way they've always been done. You meet resistance with funders who just want some happy photo to convey to the people who have given money. You know, people will always be resistant to change, and they'll particularly be resistant to change when you're taking an ethical stance on something that suggests that maybe the way it's been done before isn't the best. You're going to meet a defensive response from people sometimes, whether they're conscious of that or not. And so those are some of the challenges we've bumped into trying to do this work. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was muted.
No worries.
I just want to follow up on the circling back idea, and this is linked to what I had asked Shalini about who owns the story, whose story is it. So you say that you deal with the photographs and stories kind of in the same way you deal with medical information, you know, so that the privacy, the idea of that, you know, you've got to protect the privacy, the dignity of people, and that they own their information. You've got to have permission to share it. Is it really the same thing? So if you write a story, does the community get a veto over it? If you take a picture, does the community get to say, well, actually, you shouldn't use that or you cannot use it? So in the end, do you really believe that they own the story, or is it your story? And yeah, it's fine if they agree with it. We'd prefer that they agree with it. But if they don't, well, we still go ahead.
That's a great question. I believe that there are some aspects of the story that it's fair for the organization to share when particularly we're talking about ourselves and the work that we've done. But if there's anything that involves the actual identity of a human being, their picture, their name, details about their life that can potentially be linked to them in real life, I think they absolutely have to have veto power over that. And they can say, you know what, I know we talked about this, but I don't like that picture, or I don't like the way this is framed. And then you have to go into a good faith kind of negotiation with them and say, well, if we remove these pictures, if we change the name and make it unidentifiable, does that feel better? And if they're okay with that, then you can work to find a middle ground there. But if they're still not willing to, I think you as an organization need to be able to pivot and tell your superiors, which we all know is going to create a whole lot of strife within your comms team or whatever. Actually, sorry guys, we can't run this story. I spoke to the family and they're not comfortable with it anymore. And I think that has to be honored, particularly when I think it has to be honored in all situations, but especially when we're dealing with stories of accessing medical care or basic needs. We need to protect the privacy and dignity of everyone that we're talking about or telling a story of. And so, yeah, I do think people need to have veto power over anything that they're included in.
Okay. I think in the panel discussion, again, we could pick up on the logistics of this and whether this becomes a cycle that keeps on and on. You go back, they say no, and how do you then plan, your communications around that? But for now, Levis, if I may come to you, perhaps you could talk a bit about just the end part of what David was talking about, the second focus, the second phase of parts evolution, if you will, in storytelling, and also I'd like a sense to give the listeners, the audience, a sense of the storytelling guide toolkit and the path to that and what that then covers. So if you could take that on, I would be quite happy.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, and thank you, David. My name is Levis Nderitu. I am a Black man. I don't have hair, actually, just with black glasses and a black polo shirt based out of Nairobi. And thank you, Patrick. And before I answer your question, I think I just want to pivot and build on what Clare David has talked about, really looking at the sector broadly. And some numbers were shocking for me, Patrick, as I was just reading through. And 30 to 35% of CEOs in the development sectors are women. Only 30 to 35% are women. Even when the general sort of workers is over 70% who are in lower levels. 60%, Patrick, of senior management or leaders in international, sort of INGOs are international staff, even when 93% of the people on the field are local staff, but the leadership, 60% international staff. Let's talk a little bit about funding, because that's important in this conversation. Less than 2% of the humanitarian funding goes to Africa-led organizations, less than 2%. In fact, the data is like 1.6%. Only that goes to Africa-led organization. And if you're an organization led by a woman of color, it's 0.6%. And Patrick, this tells you these numbers because data tells a story. These numbers reflect the bias in the sector, reflects the stereotypes about capacity, about capability, about who becomes the leader, right? About what experience is actually valued. Is it the lived experience of the people, or is it a certain archetype of experience, within the sector? And we are in 2023, and the conversations have been around artificial intelligence. And this artificial intelligence, the other day, I was doing, there was this Mid-Journey tool. I was using an AI tool when you type in a text and it brings images. So I typed in and I said, image of a CEO taking a selfie. The image produced is a white man wearing a suit, okay? Image of an intelligent person. It's a white kid with glasses, image of an African family, it's a typical African family with African wear and all of that. So artificial intelligence, again, produces these stereotypes. And the reason, Patrick, is because of one big question here. Who sits at the table? And the question you asked in terms of who is this story, who owns this story? Most of the time is the people at the seat of the table are not reflective of the communities that we serve. And because of that, then the stories being produced are stereotypical stories that are half-truths. Most of the time are not complete truths. And in my work and in what David has talked about, and I'm happy to partner with David because we work together, is to really see how can we ensure that the people who are actually telling the stories are from the communities where the work happens, reflect those communities, because that is important. And then also to this question of Patrick, you asked, who really tells that story and who is it being told to? Most of the time as NGOs or civil society, we package our stories to appease the donors, right? Because, they have the money, we want the money to do the work, and we want to tell the stories that they resonate with. And it's really a chicken egg situation. If you don't tell those stories that the donors want, then you don't get the funding. Yet at the same time, we're talking about in terms of ethical storytelling, that we should tell our story, right? We should be dignifying the people. So there is a dilemma in here. And I think in this debate or these conversations, we need to open that Pandora box and really discuss in terms of who is this story being told? Are we really trying to tell this story so that the donors are happy, right? Though we are seeing shifts, donors are requiring more and more, locally led, stories and all of that. But I think there's still more work to be done. And that is why David and I and Clare and Shalini were part of the Ethical Storytelling Toolkit. We brought in 100, civil society leaders, campaigners, and activists to really develop a tool that's available in terms of, as you try to think of, even pitching the business case to your organization or building trust to the community. So the toolkit is available on DevX, and we encourage, folks who are listening to this conversation to really check it out, because it really has a rich insights into what ethical or inclusive storytelling could look like. Patrick, over to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that, Levis. Quick follow-up. Obviously, you're a Black man. You have a seat at the table,
Yes.
So in this case, what would you say being there has changed about the way a path tells stories? And is diversity enough? Because I think, giving my experience within media and journalism, is you find it's not really, lots of the ways of reporting that we complain about, the West portrays Africa this way, are really present in how African newspapers, newspapers based on the continent, report. So is it enough simply to change people? or do we need to go another step?
Diversity is not enough, Patrick. It's one step to get there. And I'm very fortunate because I report to the CEO as well. So my life is a little bit easier because, you're right at the center of, sort of power and influence. But diversity is not enough. What is needed, Patrick, is the inclusion aspect, that your voice, even when you have a seat at the table, your voice is listened to, right? And it's listened to by the key decision makers. So I think organizations, yes, are trying to change the makeup to have more diversity. Of course, there's a long way to go, but I think what is really needed in our organization is that inclusion aspect and the fairness of the equity aspect, to be honest, because even when you just look at the salaries of, say, international staff compared to local staff, we are talking about differences of 400 to 900%, huge differences, right? So there's questions of equity that we could have the same role, we have the same perhaps title, but we're not paid equally. And therefore, even our voices sometimes are not valued equally. So diversity is not enough, inclusion is what is required, and equity is what is required. And to that influences the stories that actually go out. When you know, Patrick, that you do have a voice, that your voice matters, you do have influence, then you actually have a stronger negotiating power with your editor, for example, as you push a certain story or narrative. You know what I'm talking about. And who knows, perhaps we look forward to a day when most of these editors in these global organizations will be people that look like ourselves, hopefully at some point. I'll pause there before I burn the house.
Well, I'm sure that's where we're headed, and we're all hoping to get there. Shalini, if I may bring you back in on this, because I think guys have all touched on sort of parts and bits of the elephant, and I'm afraid that sometimes it can be like the blind men of Hindustan, so trying to describe bits of the elephant, but not really getting the entire purpose. So just to drill down on the informed consent thing. At what point do you actually secure consent? Is it before the story goes out, or is it after? And if it's after, does that consent mean anything?
It's before the story goes out. Sorry?
Right. But I'm saying, if I'm doing a story, I come to you, I say, I want to photograph you, I want to write this about you, and I do it. And I go, I prepare the story, I come back to you, and I say, this is what I've done. At that point, is that where you get consent? Or is it when you ask? Actually, I shouldn't have said when it goes out, but is it at the point where you're ready to press the go button, or is it I'm just asking you permission to use it?
No, well, the way we did it is we asked permission at the start, because part of the consent is to go through the process of where we're going with this, to explain to the people what we plan on doing, what's the outcomes, where are the deliverables, which platforms we intend to use it, so that when we are interviewing them or getting the story, they are aware of what's going to happen. So we get consent at the start before we even take out the camera. And then, yes.
As you know, stories change as they evolve, as they're being done.
And that's why the going back is important. The going back and getting consent and having the discussion and showcasing. Because a lot of times people don't go back. And that's why we are in this predicament of unethical storytelling.
Right.
Yeah. Because what's also happened in the past is that people just never got consent. And then took the photos, took the images, took the story, and left. And then put it out there without consent.
Yeah,
so people are not aware.
But by going back, you mean going back before you publish,
Yes,
going
going
back after you
back
publish?
before. No, going
Before you
back
publish.
before. Yes, yes.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
the
Oh,
important
fantastic.
part.
Claire, does that sound the same for you? Is that how Claire is looking at it?
I would love to say we were doing that, but I don't think we are doing that. You know, going back before, because I think logistically that can often be quite challenging. I would love to be able to say that we're doing that systematically, and it's certainly something I think we need to look into. I think what we're looking at the moment is adjusting certain parts of the consent process so that we actually have kind of a bit more clarity around what the, you know, it's one thing to say, can I take your photograph and can I, you know, do this and that, but actually to then show how that is going to be used. So we're kind of designing pamphlets that show sort of Facebook and, you know, all the different mediums that a story could be used in, what the implications of that might be. We also ensure that we are asking questions around what would they not want to have revealed, or what part of the story would they not want to, you know, to share. And also ensuring, and I think this is an area that we certainly need to tighten up on at Clare, and I think others as well struggle with this, is making sure that there is real clarity around how to revoke consent. So how can you, you know, it may be you're happy with an image going out one day, but you know, a very difficult conflict or something could happen within a month where somebody's security situation may change, for example. So being really clear around how do you pull that back, I think, is a really important part of that as well. So yeah.
Right. So it's not a sort of like a fire and forget thing where, you know, I've given consent and that's it.
Exactly.
You know, and it's
exactly.
gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I wonder about the sort of the afterlife, and this is linked to that idea of revoking consent. So there's sort of a story doesn't just end once it's published. You know, it changes in the sense of the environment within which it's published can change, or how people understand it can change. Things that you thought were negative can become positive. Things that you thought were positive can then be understood negatively, etc. At what point, I mean, should we think about what the subjects of these stories are able to do about those sorts of perceptions, you know, after the story has gone? Or do we simply say, well, we published it then, tough luck?
I mean, I think it goes back, yeah. So it goes back to what I was saying around making sure that people have that power to revoke. But I do think there's also, you know, a really good example would be Afghanistan, for example. So where the when the de facto authorities put the ban on female NGO workers at the beginning of the year, that created a security concern for women, I think, broadly across Afghanistan. So we had to make some quite difficult decisions about actually, which is a really hard decision to make around, you know, do we need to start taking down photos of women in Afghanistan, which is a really tough call, because on one side you're wanting to protect their security, but on the other, you're kind of eliminating their story.
Right.
So, you know, that's, I think, some of the sort of practical tensions that we often have around some of these questions around, in an ideal world, we would be contacting each and every one of them and asking them about their specific situation. But often when something like that happens, and like you say, the situation suddenly changes very quickly, we have to make some really difficult calls. And obviously we have to make sure that we're doing no harm.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, you can take a picture of somebody, let's say in a crisis situation, maybe they're hungry, maybe they're the victim of an attack, but they don't want to go through their life being remembered as this, you know, so that they're, you know, so at what point do we say that, you know, these people can come in and say, well, perhaps I don't want that picture of me anymore, you know, being used or appearing and stuff, you know? So, and I think it also links to something that I wanted to ask both David and Levis, which is about audience. You know, Levis did mention about who are we writing stories to? And David, maybe I should start with you. Are the subjects of our stories also the audience? Are they part of the audience? And should we be writing knowing that they are going to be reading it?
That's a great point. And yes, I think we should be. I think historically the sector hasn't been. To Levi's point, I think the focus has been entirely to this point on stories that will appease the funder and that will approve the funding and keep the money flowing. But there's a real disconnect that happens with that, because then you're as others on the call have spoken about already this morning, you're arriving with a preconceived narrative. So that's part of the issue. Another thing that's interesting that I don't think we've touched on yet is, you know, my background is originally doing storytelling for academic medical centers in the United States. So I would do patient storytelling. The real difference there, compared to many NGOs that are in operation today, is that I lived in the community that I was telling stories about. It was a local patient, their family was accessing services at the local hospital, and the story would help raise funds to improve care at the local hospital. So it was all contained within a single culture, within a single geography, and there was an existing relationship between the storyteller and the subject. So at any moment, that person could pick up the phone and say, you know what, I actually don't really want to be featured in the campaign anymore. Can you please pull my story from it? And those feedback loops were in place. Part of the issue in a lot of development sector communications is that shared services are still concentrated. Shared services like communications are still often concentrated where the funding is, which means there's a huge cultural divide, a huge geographic divide. And that's one of the reasons why at Path, part of our shift has been focusing the lens in on professionals with whom we have relationships, so that we're telling the story of one of our own staff members and maybe how they're partnering with a health worker or a member of the health ministry to accomplish something. And so we do have access to that person to go back to them, to share things before they get published. They can reach out to us at any time and say, you know what, I actually don't really want my picture on the website anymore. But for us at Path, because we don't have as established relationships with community members, it's harder to create those feedback loops that are so important, so that people can say, no, I don't want my picture. I don't want to be the person in that photo anymore, you know, from this disaster or from this health project. Can you please pull it? And so I think we do need those feedback loops so that people can ask to be taken out of the spotlight whenever they want to, because I do believe that people own their own identities.
Mm-hmm. Oh, fantastic. Levis, I came across this concept of story taking that I thought was really interesting. The idea that we go into communities and we take our stories and then we use for our own purposes, you know, so it's not really, so it's kind of very predatory if you think about it. And I'm wondering, in the context of development and NGO and CSO comps, whether this is something that is real. Should people think of themselves, in essence, communications people like you, as journalists, as people who are actually have an obligation to essentially tell the full, balanced story, rather than the story you want to tell, which is, you know, how we've done all these good things. You know, how do people balance that? How do they walk that tightrope?
Oh, Patrick, that's a hard question. Truth is, in comms and you know, my background is in marketing and brands. That's what I studied in school. And truth is, there's always an angle, right? There's always an angle to a story. Yes, we'll be good covering maybe agriculture, we're covering health and all of this good stuff that we are doing. There's always an angle. And I think we'll be lying to each other if we say there's no there's no angle. There's always an angle. And I think the big question here is, can the angle that the storyteller, whether they're the communication person and whatever, align with the angle also of the communities in which we are telling their stories, right? I think that alignment is where the challenge is. Most of the time, our angles do not align with what the storyteller or the communities wanted to share. I think that's really the question, really. Is there alignment in those angles? But the angle is also
could I push back a little bit on that?
Go for it, yes.
I think, again, aren't you sort of creating, and Claire, I'd also like to get your thoughts on this as a former journalist. Aren't you creating sort of a collusion between the agency or the CSO and the subject to provide a certain view of a situation, of a person, when you say that, yes, this is what we want to align our agendas, and that goes back to my question. Should we regard ourselves, when we write with development comms, as journalists trying to give a full, balanced idea of the situation, or should we just accept that we are propagandists and we are doing this for our own purposes and benefit? So I'll start with you, Levis, then I'll come to Claire.
I will not answer that question that way, Patrick. You're not pushing me to the cliff. I refuse. What I would say, Patrick, is that as storytellers, because we are storytellers and we are also story takers, for sure. We are both. We're both storytellers and we are story takers. What I think should happen is that whatever angle, because there'll always be an angle. Say, for example, we're pushing for better access for vaccines, for example. That's an angle, and it's a good angle, right? And it aligns with the community and what the community wants, right? We want more representation, say, of women or people of color in leadership, that's an angle, and it aligns with what the community wants. So there's no problem in that when there is that alignment, really. So to your question, I think we should honor the communities, and at the same time, we should continue having our angle as long as it's for the greater good of the community.
Claire?
Okay, I'll try and go a bit closer to the cliff edge. Let's see. I mean, I think Henry Pierre also in the chat is asking a similar question. How much are we, or do we have to choose kind of images or stories that are very much audience driven and that will engage our audiences? And I do think that is a challenge, because I think I think there's a difference between the sort of the journalistic lens that the communications team may go on, which is more around kind of bearing witness, trying to sort of take a more systems-based approach to storytelling. You have a longer form. And then I think when you go into the kind of mass market fundraising space, where you have to get a very short, sharp image out, the traditional, and this is where we're probably, struggling, I think, more, because in that space, you're trying to elicit emotion. And, in order to get audiences to engage on an issue or a problem, you have to kind of really get an emotional response out of them. And I think traditionally that emotional response has been trying to kind of ignite some level of empathy. Empathy is a kind of direct cousin of sort of fear. So there's a sort of an emotional element to this that I think we need to shift away from. And I think this is where some of the work that, again, going back to sort of Thomas Coombs and some, looking at, and I come from a psychologist background, so I kind of think about this often through that lens, is actually how do we connect these two ideas together in ways that we're developing much more ethical approaches that are much more locally led, and in ways that will stimulate some kind of emotional response from our audience. And ideally, that emotional response needs to be something that is lovely and sustainable and actually how do we move closer towards the idea of stimulating emotions such as love and caring and these kind of ideas, which I think the world needs a lot more of right now. And I feel we still are struggling to get that connection in. And I think that's where the gap is. And I would love to hear from anyone who is cracking that.
Just a quick one for you, Claire. I didn't get what you mean by audience in that sense, because again, going back to what David had said, that we should consider the people we are, whose stories we are telling, to be part of the audience. So when it seems to me that once you include them in that, then really the story you're telling has to change. If it's not just a story for people we want donating to us, then the content of that story has to change, has to become relevant to everyone. And is it possible to actually do that?
I think that's the kind of the golden question, right? So yes, this is where we go back to that kind of tension between the moral case and the business case. So yes, of course, a key audience are the people who are telling us their story. But the business reality is that we also need, in order to continue to operate, is we need public support and we need public engagement. And that is something that is in some places waning. I mean, you just have to look at the fast news cycle. It flips from one thing to the next. People are disengaging from some of the issues that we're dealing with. So that has to be something that is part of the spectrum when we look at audiences. It's how do you, so that's what I'm trying to sort of say, is how do you connect those pieces together? And what is that sort of framing that we need to look through in order to be able to do that authentically and effectively?
Okay, I'll come to the questions in the chat in a bit. By the way, for anybody listening, if you want to, if you have a question or you want to ask, just put it in the chat and I'll get to it. Shalini, what's your view on this idea of who the audience is, and the sorts of stories that we tell? I mean, you get, in essence, hired to go tell stories. So whose stories, I mean, going back to the first question I'd asked you, whose stories are they and who are you actually telling them to? And should you adopt a more journalistic stance, where it's about telling the whole truth rather than just the brief that you've been given by your client?
I don't think there's a hard and fast answer to that. I think it's more project-based. It depends on the kind of project we are looking at, because some projects require a more journalistic approach, while others needed to be more brand-focused, brand-centric, depending on the audience. But I think as we are starting this process and starting the conversation, we always need to ask ourselves, what does this serve? Who does this serve? Who's this project serving? Does it benefit the audience? Does it benefit the people? Who's the audience? And also, does it benefit our narrative, client's narrative? And then in terms of, we don't jeopardize the process by saying, okay, we're going to just manipulate part of the story so that it serves the audience. Because then we're coming back to where we are right now.
Okay.
Away from.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a balancing act. And that's why we have to keep going through the motion of what happens on ground, how we can communicate with the donors, and how we can create a story that respects all partners, because everyone's involved.
Right. And is this, in terms of the obligations then that you owe, obviously we live in a globalized world. So what you write for your donors is going to be seen, is going to get onto the internet, it's going to be seen by everybody. You know, do you have an obligation to other people who may not see this as simply communication to a donor? And they might think of this as, it's telling me the truth about a place.
Yes, you do have that obligation. You need to take other factors into account, like coming off projects in Congo. The client wants you to tell the truth. Then when we give them the truth, it's like, no, it's the election year. We don't want to piss off the government. So maybe hold back on the truth a little bit. But we still want the truth, because that's what we're paying you to give us. We have no ethics. I don't want you to lie. So yes, it's a balancing act. That's all I have to say. And the fact that we're opening up that conversation, and we're not just giving the client anymore what they want for the audience. We are now bringing in the perspective of the people's stories we're telling. So it's going to be changing and evolving, and that's why the toolkit was really good to do, because I also never thought about these things prior to
I love the toolkit. I think if only for the fact that it recognizes that it's the start of a conversation. So it's like, it's not like everybody has it figured it out. It's about how do we actually start moving in that direction. Levi, there's Levis, there's a question in the chat, from Dulce Pedroso. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, of the Center of Disaster Protection. And it asked whether we could say something, whether the speakers could say something about artist-created illustrations or AI-generated pictures of fictional characters, using those to tell a story. And assuming they don't reinforce negative stereotypes, what do you think of that sort of approach as an alternative to portraying real people?
No, that's a good suggestion. Honestly, I like that idea. I think for me, my proposition is because
wait, you like it? Does it not tamper with the idea of truth? If this is AI, are we really telling the story of what's happening on the ground?
Not really. I think my position is about I'm more interested in who are the people behind the data, because all AI, the people behind, that data, where that data came from, is the data biased, or is it telling the reality of the current position of the people? Does it really reflect the people in a more dignified way? I wouldn't, sort of write off the idea simply because it's not, sort of like, real people per se, but I think it's an alternative for sure.
Right. So I have a question. I think it's probably either Shalini or Claire can pick this up with regard to informed consent, and it's how do you deal with that when children are involved? Maybe Claire?
Yes. So children, as I mentioned earlier, is definitely, we would consider children as a vulnerable population. And so we, in order to get consent from a child, obviously you need parent or, the parent or guardian's permission and consent. So that is, and actually we've had to really tighten that up, because often the term guardian could be misinterpreted to be maybe the teacher of a class in a school, or so on and so forth. So you have to be really cautious on that. What we also have is what we call our pillars of risk. So that's the name, that's the location, and the sort of physical representation, so an image. So we would always remove one or two of those pillars with children. But yeah, we tend to you have to be very careful, I think, with children, and we are also very cautious around the length of use for that. So I think it goes back to the question you were asking, Patrick, around at what point do you kind of, when is it no longer appropriate to, and I think that's particularly true for children, because I have seen, actually not at Care, but I've seen it in other organizations, I'm not going to mention who, where there's been a sort of a hunger campaign, and I've seen an image that's been used for that. And when you do a very quick Google image search, it's actually of a child from 5 or 6 years ago being used in a new campaign. So, you know, you need to be really, in terms of archiving as well, be really stringent on when is the appropriate time to archive that. So yeah, handle with care, I think, is the situation with minors.
Right. David, if I may put to you this, there's somebody who asked about the use of unidentifiable photos. So I guess this is in places where you're dealing maybe with a mass crowd. We've seen for example, in the images coming out of Gaza, you know, and the people being forced to evacuate or being expelled from their homes and stuff. There's questions, you know, about the ethics of using those sorts of images. Now, what do you think? I mean, the questioner says that there is still some pushback that this will not be as impactful. And is there any research on this and what your experiences are here? So I don't know what you think about using those sorts of images and the ethical questions that come with them.
It's a great question and a good topic. There is, because everything kind of needs to be decided on a case-by-case basis, there's not one blanket answer there. But I will say that in general, PATH supports the use of unidentifiable images, and that's a lot of the guidance that we give to our communicators when they're going to go take photo shoots, is make sure that you've gone through an informed consent process with the 1 or 2 people who you're actually featuring, which in most of our communications now are generally a health worker, a doctor, a nurse, someone who's operating in a professional capacity. And we're instructing our photographers to shoot photographs from an angle so that patients' faces are not identifiable. So the classic example of this that you'll see a lot of on our website already is maybe someone's getting vaccinated as part of a vaccination campaign, and the photographer will shoot over the patient's shoulder. So you only see the patient's arm and that they're getting vaccinated, and the focus is on the health worker who's providing a professional service, who has a relationship with PATH or with the program folks who work in that place. And so I think from a managing risk to the community standpoint, it's a really good approach to take, assuming the photographs are still dignified. Of course, the example you gave, Patrick, of like the crisis in Gaza, that starts to blur the line for an NGO, I think, about what constitutes a dignified image. But assuming that people are being treated with dignity and that the rest of the image is appropriate, I think unidentifiable photographs are a great way to go. And in our own fundraising efforts at PATH, we've not seen any drop off as a result of doing that. In fact, our audiences seem to respond better to images of progress, of collaboration, of professional services being provided, as opposed to images of desperation, to use some of the language someone shared in the chat. So I don't know if there's any specific academic research on that yet, but I can say, at least anecdotally from our own experience at our organization, that kind of approach hasn't impacted us negatively at all.
All right. Okay. Shalini, maybe you could take this on somebody asking about the case of documentaries and how we ensure that the subjects of storytellers are involved in development of key questions and concepts. I think that would be right up your alley.
Sorry, repeat the question. You just cut off.
They're asking how you ensure that subjects of documentaries are involved in the development of the concept of it, you know.
Oh, okay.
And the quick questions within it, yeah.
Oh, okay. In the beginning, when I stated about the process, part of the process would be to have like these round tables or market research done with subjects, maybe not subjects that we're going to interview, but people that are from the areas, people that are concerned, getting a feel for what's really happening, so that by the time when we get to the key players of the documentary, we already have a better understanding of what's happening on the ground. Yeah, that's how we get the involvement from upfront.
Okay. Right. Yeah, and I guess so the people already know by the time you come down to start shooting,
Yes,
there's an idea this is what's being told, and they've already bought into that concept. It's not a
exactly.
concept that's being parachuted in.
Yeah, we're not just coming in there and saying, okay, how is this changing your life?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So we are almost out of time, and I just wanted to give you guys each a minute. I'd like us to sort of do just a final roundup on something that, what do you think people should take away from this? And what's a key thing that you would want the audience to remember when it comes to how they better tell ethical stories? So I start with you, Shalini. Shalini, are you there? Can you hear me?
No, sorry. No, I think everyone's like put everything so succinctly and covered a lot of things. But I think what I would like to say is that respect, cornerstone of the storytelling, respect all players, respect the process, respect the story. And if at any stage, sometimes the respect element is gone by one of the players, maybe not telling the story is the story.
Great. Claire?
Oh, sorry, where am I? I'm here. So, yeah, oh, such a good question. I think it would be that ethical communications is a window to an organization. So and as communicators, you have we're increasingly being held to account by the public. And so that sort of line between what happens internally and externally is becoming very blurred. I think that gives communications teams quite a lot of power actually to influence change within your organization. So I often hear my colleagues in comms saying, where does program end and communication start? So I think that, there are, for communications to be truly ethical, it needs to, as the window to the organization itself needs to be ethical. And I think communications can play a real role in terms of that internal advocacy. So, if we look at the Pledge for Change, which again I think is a great initiative, that is really kind of captured in that. So there's two other pledges as well as one on sort of comms, which is around, influencing wider change. So really looking at the systemic kind of blockages to some of these issues and equitable partnerships. So, if we want our communications to be more grounded and more locally driven, then the organizations we work in must also be more grounded and locally driven.
Okay.
So I would leave it there.
All right. Thanks. David?
Thanks, Patrick. I think what I'd want people to leave with is just the sense that there is no perfect way to do this, and that everything that you and your organization do is going to have to be decided in the context of what's right for that community, what's right for that particular communication, and how can you best treat everyone with dignity and respect throughout the whole process. As Shalini said, I think I refer to people to this process as failing in the right direction. And the thing that I hope people take away from this conversation and from the toolkit that all of us were honored to contribute to is that you don't have to have it all perfect before you start making progress. Probably if you're in a comms role, you can start doing things a little bit better today, right now, just by trying to reduce harm and take better care of the people whose stories you're telling.
Right. So you don't have to have it all 100% figured out.
Yeah, exactly.
Levis?
Representation matters. Representation matters, and whatever you are, interrupt the bias. The biases are there, the stereotypes are there, interrupt the bias.
All right. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks to everyone for joining in. So I'll hand it over back to Miriam.
Thank you, Patrick, for guiding us in this conversation, and thanks so much to our panelists for your thoughtful contributions. Lots to think about for sure and reflect upon in our work. Thanks also to the audience for joining us today and for making this a really engaging question and an insightful session as well. And thanks again for joining.